Howdy, howdy, howdy. Welcome to a Thursday Collection Connection. Where we're playing that game, it's just an excuse to talk about records. Today we are going to forge a connection between Greta Van Fleet's Starcatcher album and The Ballad of Darren, the new album from Blur. But first we need to spell out the connection between the previous pair of albums, which was Tame Impala's The Slow Rush and the Greta Van Fleet Starcatcher album. And the connection there is that some of the photography and artwork was done by Neil Krug, who's most known, I suppose, for his extensive work with Lana Del Rey, but he did the work on both of those records. He didn't shoot the cover of the Greta Van Fleet, but did do the inner photos for that album. Nobody got that connection, and so point goes to us. Was a trickier one. It took a little bit of research, but with that all sorted, on with the show. Alright, so Eric showed the Greta Van Fleet album, Starcatcher, the new one. I know about them more by reputation than by their actual music. I know that they appeared very early in their run, I think, on Saturday Night Live, at a time when the initial groundswell behind them was like, hey, wow, these guys are great. They're going to revive 70s rock. And it feels like almost instantly the tide turned against them, and rather than championing 70s rock, they were seen as just sort of ripping and being very unoriginal from 70s rock, namely Led Zeppelin. But I really don't know any of their albums. So listening to the Starcatcher album with fresh ears, I thought it wasn't bad. Not completely in my ballpark, but I thought it was pretty easy to listen to. The vocals, rather than sounding like Robert Plant to me, sounded more, early on I was thinking of Ann Wilson from Heart, and sort of later they get a little bit more sort of enunciated and spooky, and that made me think of Grace Slick from Jefferson Airplane. And so I guess the vocals being so high, it's not a rip to say that he reminded me. They're great vocalists, both of them, Ann Wilson and Grace Slick. But that's what they made me think of personally. My biggest gripe with the album is that it seems clearly to be music that is made to be played loudly, but when I tried to play it loudly, the distortion on my speakers was so bad that it introduced sort of a digital distortion on top of just, distortion that sort of sounded like the digital version of scraping a fork across a plate. Just almost impossible to listen to. So in order to listen to it, I kind of had to turn it down, which seems antithetical to their mission statement. So with that one caveat aside, that I couldn't actually listen to it very loud because it was just so brick-walled and noise-forward that I just couldn't turn it up very much. And I have some decent speakers, but that album was killing them on the streaming. I would say, yeah, it's good. It makes me think a little bit of a recent album for somebody who's not necessarily a super 70s music fan. In the last couple of years, one of my favorite albums has been by a band called Fur, whose album When You Walk Away is clearly very 70s inspired, but they really pull some fantastic pop tunes out of it. I would definitely recommend go check out that. Maybe I'll have an opportunity to talk about that album someday. But Fur, When You Walk Away, terrific record. Greta Van Fleet apparently was named after somebody who the band heard spoken about named Gretna Van Fleet, and they changed it a little bit. So this would have been a perfect time as a band that is sort of named after a person but with a creative spelling of their name. Would have been a great time for me to pull out some Lynyrd Skynyrd if I had any, but again, not a huge fan of 70s rock, so I don't have any Lynyrd Skynyrd. So let's go ahead with the connection that I actually did make. Alright, so we are talking about The Ballad of Darren by Blur. It's their 9th album. a really surprise album. It only came out this past July, so I haven't gotten super familiar with it, but I have given it a half dozen spins, boosted by listening to it a couple times here in the last few days. But it's good. It's especially a surprise since the latest Gorilla album only came out this year in February. So it's very hot on the heels. And it's their first album since The Magic Whip in 2015. And one could argue their first album on purpose since all the way back to Think Tank, the album that they made without founding member Graham Coxon. So with The Magic Whip in 2015, which is an album that I have, I skipped everything between the self-titled Blur album that had song 2 on it, sort of their biggest and only real moment of relevance in the US, despite being huge in England, their home country. I enjoyed The Magic Whip, but I did not realize until much, much later, much later, kind of doing my research for this album this week, that album came together because of some jams that they threw together. They went to Japan to do some shows that got canceled, and so instead, while they were there, they just kind of went into a studio and messed around a little bit and just sort of left those ideas there in the studio, and Graham Coxon decided to enlist their longtime producer Stephen Street to try and take those jams and fit them into some sort of an album shape. Which he did. I enjoyed it quite a bit, but with The Ballad of Darren, they went with the intention of making an album. They were using, I think, a lot of songs that Damon Albarn, the lead singer, had written and didn't really have, kind of fully into shape. So the first track on The Ballad of Darren, which is just called The Ballad, may be the song that the album was titled for. I think that it was a song that was in sort of an unfinished shape, and one of a first roadie but then a friend of the band was a big champion for and really wanted them to finish the song. His name was Darren, and he sort of got his dedication right there in the album title. But I think a lot of these were songs, lyrics with maybe some degree of melody to them that Damon Albarn had and thought maybe they were Blur appropriate, and Graham Coxon and the rest of the band, Dave Roundtree and Alex James, the original 4 guys from the band, kind of whipped up some musical tracks, to kind of support those songs, and they quickly took shape. And so yeah, this was an album that they actually meant to make rather than one that was just sort of made with recordings after the fact. I especially like the third track of Barbaric, which is kind of an instant bop. It's the one I've listened to the most so far. It, along with, to a degree, St. Charles Square, sound the most sort of like classic Blur, but I would say Barbaric sounds like Great Escape Blur, and St. Charles Square sounds like a kind of the slightly messier Blur of the self-titled album later in the 90s. Damon Albarn, and I admit I haven't quite kept up with his career, it's only very spotty. And I have the last couple of Gorillaz albums, but I have to say I haven't really dug into those very deeply either. I'm curious as to at what point Damon Albarn, his croon, started sounding exactly like David Bowie's. He's like a dead ringer for David Bowie these days. It seems like the Damon Albarn at his hardest singing, his most effort singing, is just a dead ringer for David Bowie, sort of at his lowest effort singing, sort of like a China girl kind of vocal. And it's uncanny to me. It sounds more like David Bowie to me quite often than it does Damon Albarn. So I don't know when that happened. I think it's interesting. Maybe it's just me. This album, the version that I have here is the deluxe version, which comes with a couple of extra songs on it, The Rabbi and the Swan, and I guess the vinyl edition, the deluxe edition came with a bonus 7-inch that had those 2 songs on it. But the album itself is only 10 tracks in its purest form. It has 12 here. But yeah, without having the opportunity, if you'd like to take a deep dive into it, Murdoch from Murdoch's Music Minute did not guess this week's connection, but he did make a video going track by track over the making, the inspiration, and the songs themselves of this album. So you can look for his Ballad of Darren review on his channel. I had watched it when he put it out and watched it again just to remind myself of a few things. But yeah, I would say definitely worth your time. It's an older, more contemplative Blur. I love the sort of refrain on Barbaric, where they say, we've lost the feeling that we thought we'd never lose. Sort of a very downbeat lyric going along with a fairly upbeat, catchy pop backing. Yeah, just makes kind of the whole thing seem very deep-seated, very thought out, and very reflective on how they got to this point. Especially poignant because it is only their second album in 20 years and first intentional Blur album, really, in those 20 years and even longer, 24 years if you want to go back to the last album that had all 4 original members on it, 13. And so, yeah, it's a nifty thing that kind of dropped out of the sky, out of nowhere. I'm happy I bought it. Still doesn't make me want to buy Think Tank and 13, but I'm happy with the Blur. It's the 5th Blur I have, their 9th album overall. Their 7th straight album to go to #1 in the UK, although interest has dropped off back to where it was in the early 90s in the US. This only just cracked the top 100 at number 94 in the US. Kind of steadily going downhill. At least the Magic Whip apparently hit number 24 in the US. I guess they're a product of a bygone age at this point, and only the fogies and the fuddy-duddies maybe are still interested in Blur, but it's worthwhile, definitely worth picking up, and worth giving a listen. Again, my personal recommendation is for Barbaric, and much of the rest is much slower and comprising ballads, just very mid-tempo overall. But yeah, if you miss Blur and a little bit miss David Bowie, this is a great album to come back to and sort of bask in its getting older, as we all are. So with that, I will throw that over to Eric, who I think I neglected to say at the top of the video. My brother Plastic Eric from the Plastic Soundwave Cult channel is the guy that I play the game with. He shows an album, I show an album, and the catch is that the album has to in some way relate to the album that the other one showed, and we just do that in an endless circle, and we ask you to find the connection. And so that is where we will leave it, with me asking you to leave in the comments what you think the connection is between Blur's The Ballad of Darren from 2023 and Greta Van Fleet's Starcatcher album, also from 2023. We've broken the seal on 2023 albums here on the Collection Connection. I think those are the first 2 that we've done. But yeah, see if you can figure out the connection and let us know in the comments. And with that, I said my piece, so I thank you for watching, and bye-bye.